April 18, 1942, Tokyo, Japan, 12:30 p.m. The spring sun hangs over the imperial capital, filtering through a high, thin haze. It is a Friday, a workday like any other in the sixth month of Japan's sprawling Pacific War. In the Marunouchi district, government clerks return to their desks after lunch. Near the moat of the imperial palace, cherry blossoms, past their peak, scatter pink petals onto still water. The mood is one of serene confidence, a nation breathing the air of victory. Newspapers for weeks have detailed triumph after triumph. Hong Kong fallen, Singapore surrendered, the Dutch East Indies secured. The memory of the attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor is not one of anxiety, but of pride, a brilliant first blow that shattered a giant and secured the homeland behind an ocean shield deemed impassable. Suddenly, a new sound cuts through the urban hum, not the familiar drone of civil aviation or the disciplined formation of training aircraft. This is lower, rougher, a throaty roar skimming the rooftops. Eyes look up. Then the air raid sirens begin their slow, hesitant wail, a sound many hear for the first time. From the north, a twin-engine aircraft, large and unfamiliar in silhouette, streaks past the pinnacle of the Diet building. It is too fast for a bomber, too large for a fighter. A few seconds later, a series of deep, crumping thuds roll from the eastern industrial districts, not the collapse of a city, but the unmistakable rude punctuation of high explosives. On a dockyard, black smoke begins to coil into the afternoon sky. The clockwork order of the capital stutters, freezes. In the War Ministry offices, officers rush to windows, faces etched not with fear but with sheer disbelieving confusion. The sacred soil is violated. The impossible has happened. The boastful narrative of absolute security, carefully maintained since December 7th, lies shattered among the first, scattered bomb craters. This moment of profound psychological rupture was not the work of a vast armada, but of 16 medium bombers, led by a man whose name would become a synonym for audacious retribution. The path to this clear April shock began not over Tokyo, but in the smoldering wreckage of another harbor, half a world away. The echoes of the last explosions over Pearl Harbor had not yet faded before they were replaced by a new, relentless drumbeat of conquest. For Japan's high command, the attack of December 7, 1941, was not a mere raid. It was the opening move of a strategic masterstroke designed to shatter American will and buy the time needed to carve out a self-sufficient empire, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In the weeks and months that followed, their ambitions seemed not just plausible, but divinely ordained. The wave of victories was staggering in its speed and totality. British Malaya fell. The impregnable fortress of Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered on February 15, 1942, with over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops marching into captivity. The image of a Japanese soldier astride a captured British anti-aircraft gun became an iconic photograph of imperial hubris fulfilled. The Dutch East Indies, rich in the oil that was the lifeblood of modern warfare, were overrun by March. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces, cut off and besieged on the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor, were in their death throes. The Indian Ocean was raided. Burma was invaded. The map of the Pacific and Southeast Asia was being violently redrawn in the color of the rising sun, and it was happening with a breathtaking velocity that stunned the world. In Tokyo, this created a state of triumphant, almost feverish confidence. The Imperial General Headquarters, housed in its purpose-built concrete bunker complex near the palace, operated with the certainty of a priesthood presiding over a destined victory. Their operational doctrine, the Kantai-Kessen or decisive battle strategy, had been validated, or so it seemed. The plan had always been to lure the weakened American fleet across the Pacific, attrit it with submarines and land-based air power, and then annihilate it in a single, colossal surface engagement near Japan. Pearl Harbor had executed the first part perfectly. Now, with the resource-rich southern perimeter Secured, Japan could dig in, consolidate, and await the inevitable doomed American counterthrust. The home islands, safeguarded by thousands of miles of ocean and a screen of occupied islands, were considered a sacred citadel. This belief was not merely strategic, it was deeply psychological and spiritual. The emperor, a divine being, resided in Tokyo. His person and his capital were protected by more than guns and ships. They were shielded by national polity, kokutai, the unique spiritual essence of Japan that made its soil inviolable. To suggest that American bombs could fall on the emperor's capital was not just a tactical assessment, it was blasphemy. The boast was not merely one of military strength, but of spiritual invincibility. The war, from their vantage point in April 1942, was progressing exactly according to a flawless, predestined script. Yet across the vast expanse of the Pacific, in a Washington, D.C., gripped by a mixture of rage, shame, and grim determination, a single, relentless idea was taking shape. It was an idea born from the need to break this very psychology, to pierce the aura of invincibility, and to write a different narrative, one that would begin with a daring, symbolic stroke aimed directly at the heart of Japanese confidence. The news from Pearl Harbor struck the United States not just as a military defeat, but as a profound national humiliation. The images of burning battleships, the towering columns of smoke, and the staggering loss of life, 403 Americans killed, created a psychic wound that demanded more than a long-term strategy for victory. It demanded catharsis, a tangible, immediate act of retribution. In the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the architect of the Germany First grand strategy, understood this visceral need. The American people and the Allies watching anxiously from London and Moscow required proof that the United States could and would strike back. The question was not if, but how. The logistical realities were brutally forbidding. Japan's defensive perimeter, by early 1942, stretched from the Kuril Islands in the north, through the Marshall and Gilbert Islands down to the newly captured bastion of Rabaul, to reach the Japanese home islands with existing land-based bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress was impossible. They lacked the range. Aircraft carriers could get closer, but their short-ranged fighters and dive bombers would have to penetrate layered defenses, incurring catastrophic losses for minimal effect. The United States Navy, with its battleship fleet crippled, was in no position to risk its precious few carriers in a suicidal dash into Japan's inner defensive zone. A deep sense of frustration settled over the Pentagon. The war would be long, they knew, but the public and the commander-in-chief needed a sign now. The seed of an answer was planted in the mind of a Navy staff officer, Captain Francis S. Lowe, in January 1942, observing twin-engine Army bombers practicing takeoffs from a runway outline painted on a Norfolk airfield to simulate a carrier deck. He had a sudden, heretical thought. What if an Army medium bomber could actually take off from a carrier? He took the idea to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King, a man known for his abrasive demeanor and tactical aggression. King approved immediate exploration. The concept found its perfect executor in Lieutenant Colonel James H. Jimmy Doolittle of the United States Army Air Forces. Doolittle, 45, was already a legend in aviation circles, a brilliant aeronautical engineer, a record-setting pilot who had won the Schneider Trophy, and a man who combined cool intellect with a taste for calculated risk. He was handed the ultimate challenge: turn a theoretical notion into a combat mission. The technical puzzle was immense. The aircraft had to have sufficient range to fly roughly 2,400 miles while carrying a 2,000-pound bomb load. It had to be sturdy enough to withstand a carrier launch and a low-level overwater flight, yet capable of taking off in the space of a ship's deck under 500 feet. After analysis, only one aircraft fit the punishing criteria: the North American B-25 Mitchell. It was a land-based medium bomber with a wingspan just narrow enough to fit on a carrier's deck without obstructing the island's superstructure. The plan, crystallizing under Doolittle's leadership, was audacious to the point of fantasy. A Navy task force centered on the new carrier, USS Hornet, would carry 16 B-25Bs to within 450 miles of Japan. The bombers would launch at dusk, strike military and industrial targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya under cover of darkness, and then fly another 1,100 miles to Allied airfields in unoccupied China. The entire operation balanced on a knife's edge of timing. Weather, secrecy, and sheer luck. It was a long-odds gamble, but for Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs it was a gamble worth taking. The objective was clear: to deliver psychological shock to the Japanese leadership and a massive morale boost to the American public. The target was not just infrastructure, it was the unshakable confidence festering in the Imperial General Headquarters. As Doolittle's volunteers began their secret, grueling training at Eglin Field in Florida, and the Hornet was readied for her strange cargo on the West Coast, the stage was being set for a collision between American ingenuity and Japanese dogma. The raid would test not only machines and men, but the very core of two competing visions of warfare. One side saw itself protected by an impenetrable strategic and spiritual fortress. The other was determined to prove that no such fortress existed. This convergence of need, planning, and technology formed the foundation of an operation that would irrevocably alter the strategic calculus of the Pacific War. To understand its full impact, we must examine it from multiple perspectives, beginning with the man tasked with turning a symbol of retaliation into a concrete reality. James Harold Doolittle stood at the nexus of aviation's pioneer past and its martial future. He was not a stereotypical, swaggering combat pilot, but a scientist of the air. With a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, he had been instrumental developing instrument flying, liberating aviation from the constraints of clear weather and visual cues. This was a man who trusted calibration over instinct, preparation over bravado, yet beneath the calm, analytical exterior burned a competitive fire. He had won every major air racing trophy, pushing aircraft to their limits. When Captain Lowe's carrier launch concept reached the upper echelons of the USAAF, Doolittle was the inevitable choice. He possessed the technical expertise to modify the aircraft, the operational genius to plan the mission, and the moral authority to lead it. His first task was selecting his weapon. The B-25 Mitchell was a robust, versatile bomber, but it was never designed for the stresses of a carrier launch. Doolittle's engineering mind went to work. He supervised a ruthless program of weight stripping. The lower gun turret was removed, its space filled with a collapsible 60-gallon rubber fuel tank. The heavy liaison radio was tossed out, replaced by a simple homing beacon. The Norden bombsight, the vaunted secret weapon for high-altitude precision, was irrelevant for a low-level raid. In its place, crews installed a simple 20-cent device called the Mark Twain, a length of metal with two sighting nails, calibrated for 1,500 foot release. Even the de-icing equipment was deemed superfluous weight and removed to deter tail-chasing fighters. Crafty engineers fashioned broomsticks painted black, slotting them into the rear fuselage to mimic the menacing barrels of .50 caliber machine guns. But the most critical modification was fuel. To reach China after bombing Japan, range was everything. Additional tanks were fitted in the bomb bay, the crawlway above, and the ventral turret area. The aircraft would become a flying fuel drum. Its total capacity nearly doubled to 1,141 gallons. Every change was a trade-off. More fuel meant greater takeoff weight and risk. Doolittle calculated it to the ounce. He then selected the men. 140 volunteers from the 17th Bombardment Group. None told their true target. The training at Eglin Field was singularly focused, under the tutelage of a legendary Navy pilot, Lieutenant Henry Miller. The Army aviators learned to coax a 31,000-pound Bomber into the air using just 467 feet of runway, the length of the Hornet's deck. They practiced day and night, in calm and in wind, until the act of slamming throttles to full war emergency power and hurtling toward a non-existent ship's bow became a terrifying kind of muscle memory. Doolittle led every practice run. He would be the first off the deck, proving it could be done. His leadership was quiet, demanding, and absolute. He was not sending his men on a mission, he was leading them. This fusion of technical mastery and personal accountability would define the entire operation, transforming a desperate symbolic gesture into a meticulously planned instrument of strategic shock. The USS Hornet, CV-8, sailed from San Francisco Bay on April 2, 1942, a spectacle that baffled onlookers. Lashed to her flight deck in two neat rows were 16 U.S. Army Forces B-25B Mitchell medium bombers. Their wings overhung the deck edge. Their olive-drab fuselages towered over the Navy's own sleek SBD Dauntless dive bombers. In F-4F Wildcat fighters, which were crammed below, it was a visual paradox, a flat top converted into a delivery system for land-based weapons. The ship itself became a hybrid machine, a testament to unprecedented inter-service cooperation forged in the urgency of revenge. Every aspect of the B-25's design was subtly perverted for this one mission. The process of loading the bombers onto the carrier had been its own feat of engineering, using the dockyard cranes at Naval Air Station Alameda, now at sea, Navy crews and Army mechanics worked in a continuous, rolling ballet of final modifications and checks under Doolittle's watchful eye. The twin Wright R-2600 Cyclone engines were tuned to perfection. The extra fuel tanks were tested for leaks. The makeshift Mark Twain bomb sights were given final calibrations on a chalk line drawn on the deck. The bombers were armed with a mix of payloads, 3 carried clusters of incendiaries to maximize urban psychological effect, while the rest were loaded with 500-pound general purpose bombs. Each bomb was festooned with Japanese medals a Navy officer had collected pre-war days, a crude but potent gesture of contempt. The true technological gamble, however, was not just the launch, but the entire flight profile. These bombers would not be flying at 20,000 feet. The plan called for a wave top approach, skimming as low as 200 feet above the water to avoid Japanese radar and patrol craft. This required immense pilot concentration and placed enormous strain on the aircraft's airframes, navigating by dead reckoning across featureless ocean for hours. Then, after navigating to their specific city targets, using maps copied from a National Geographic magazine, they would pop up to 1,500 feet for bomb release before diving back down to treetop level to escape. The B-25, a stable medium-altitude bomber, was being asked to perform like a giant, cumbersome fighter. Its success relied on the sheer audacity of the concept and the skill of the crews pushing their machines into a performance envelope never envisioned by their designers. While Doolittle's men practiced their short takeoffs and the Hornet steamed west, the defenders of the Japanese home islands rested in a state of supreme, almost dogmatic confidence. The Imperial Japanese Navy's concept of homeland defense was built on concentric rings of vigilance, an outer picket line of armed fishing trawlers. The Junigo Kantai No. 12 Patrol Unit was stationed over 600 miles from Tokyo Bay. These vessels, equipped with radio but limited radar, were the tripwires. Behind them lay land-based air patrols and a growing, if still rudimentary, network of early warning radar stations. The combined fleet's main carrier force, the WW2I, which had struck Pearl Harbor, was the mobile counter-strike force. This layered system was believed to be impregnable, but the defense ran deeper than hardware. It was woven into the very fabric of the Japanese military psyche. The concept of Kokutai held that Japan was a land of the gods, divinely protected and uniquely virtuous. This spiritual nationalism translated into a firm belief that the commitment and purity of the Japanese warrior, the Yamato Damasha or Japanese spirit, could overcome material disadvantage. Logically, this extended to the belief that the heart of this divine nation was simply beyond the reach of a decadent, materialistic foe. Senior officers in the Imperial General Headquarters openly scoffed at the idea of an American attack on the homeland. The Americans had been cowardly and unprepared at Pearl Harbor. How could they possibly project power across the vast Pacific to strike the sacred capital? To suggest otherwise was to doubt the nation's spiritual fortitude. This created a dangerous cognitive blind spot. Reports of increased American radio traffic and carrier movements in the mid-Pacific in early April were noted but not connected to a direct threat against Japan proper. The prevailing assumption was that any American move would be a relief attempt for the Philippines or a counterattack against the newly won southern perimeter. The picket line was seen as a formality, the home defense forces as a garrison in an already secure rear area. The very idea that the U.S. could or would attempt a carrier-borne bombing raid on Tokyo was not just considered improbable, it was considered irrational and therefore impossible. This fortress mindset, built on a foundation of racial superiority and strategic dogma, left the capital psychologically undefended. The defenders were looking for a conventional attack from the expected directions. They were utterly unprepared for a symbol to come screaming in from an empty quarter of the sea. The collision course was set. On one side, a force leveraging innovation, adaptability, and a hunger for retribution. On the other, a command structure armored in certainty, viewing the vast ocean as their moat and their cultural destiny as their shield. The point of impact would not be a battlefield, but the sky over the most confident city on Earth. The true scope of the operation expanded beyond the Hornet. She did not sail alone. Designated Task Force 16.2, she was joined at sea by Task Force 16.1, centered on the veteran carrier USS Enterprise, under the overall command of the pugnacious Vice Admiral William F. Bull Halsey aboard the latter. The Enterprise's role was critical. Her air group would provide combat air patrol and, crucially, scout ahead for enemy picket vessels. The two carriers, screened by 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 fleet oilers, became a needle threading its way across the North Pacific, a route chosen for its typically foul weather and sparse shipping lanes to maximize secrecy. For 16 days, the force battled high seas and gale force winds, a miserable passage for the Navy. Crews and the airsick Army men crammed into their bulky bombers. The tension was a living thing coiled in every corridor. Radio silence was absolute. Every lookout's report of a smudge on the horizon sent a jolt of adrenaline through the task force. The plan was to reach a launch point 450 miles east of Tokyo on the afternoon of April 18th. Launch at dusk and have the bombers arrive over their targets under cover of night. But the ocean is vast and chance is ever present. At 03:10 on April 18th, while still over 650 nautical miles from Japan, the Enterprise's radar picked up a contact, a Japanese picket boat. The Nidomaru patrol boat number 23 had strayed far beyond its assigned station. A dawn patrol of Enterprise SBDs promptly attacked it, but not before the Nidomaru had radioed a cryptic but alarming message: 3 enemy aircraft carriers sighted at our position 650 nautical miles east of Inubosaki. The message was received in Tokyo, but its sheer improbability, carriers this far west, caused fatal delays in decoding and belief. On the bridge of the Enterprise, however, Halsey and Doolittle faced a brutal calculus. The task force was now compromised. To continue inward was to sail into the heart of an alerted and mobilizing Japanese naval and air response. The element of surprise, the mission's only true shield, was evaporating. Doolittle made the call without hesitation. They would launch immediately. Now it was 0800, over 170 miles farther from Japan than planned, in daylight, against rising seas and a howling wind. It meant the bombers would likely not have enough fuel to reach the designated friendly airfields in China. It meant a daylight raid over some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. It was, by the original metrics, a prescription for disaster, yet to turn back was unthinkable. On the signal, Army pilots man your planes. Doolittle, in the lead B-25 Hornet airplane 4023-44, revved his engines as the ship pitched violently in the swells, with mere feet of deck behind him and a churning gray void ahead. He released the brakes. The bomber lumbered forward, its left wheel on the white line painted on the deck, its right wheel on the very edge of the ship. It dipped sickeningly toward the waves, then, with agonizing slowness, began to climb. Against all odds, he was airborne, one by one, in a display of superb airmanship forged at Eglin Field. The remaining 15 B-25s followed him into the gale. By 0920, the last bomber, piloted by Captain Edward J. York, had cleared the deck. The Hornet, her strange children gone, turned sharply and, with the rest of Task Force 16, fled eastward. At full speed, the raiders were on their own. For hours, the 16 bombers flew west, navigating by compass and dead reckoning, skimming so low over the white-capped Pacific that spray from wave crests salted their wind screens. They crossed the Japanese coastline north of Tokyo shortly after noon, spreading out to strike multiple cities as planned. What they found was a nation utterly unready for them. Below, farmers looked up from rice paddies, schoolchildren waved. Many assumed the unfamiliar, star-marked planes were new Japanese aircraft on a training flight. Japanese air defense, operating on the confused and disbelieved picket boat report, was in chaotic disarray. A handful of patrolling Nakajima Kai-27 Nate fighters, obsolescent and slow, were scrambled but failed to intercept the faster, low-flying B-25s. Anti-aircraft batteries, when they finally opened up, fired wildly, their shells bursting harmlessly above the raiders' flight altitude. Over Tokyo itself, Doolittle pulled up to 1,500 feet. His target was a series of industrial and military facilities. Through his simple Mark Twain sight, he watched his bombs fall away. Explosions blossomed near a steelworks, an oil tank farm, and a power plant. Across the city and in Yokohama, Kobe, Nagoya, and Yokosuka, the other bombers delivered their payloads. The physical damage was, in strategic terms, minor, perhaps 50 killed, some factories damaged, a light cruiser in dry dock slightly injured, but the psychological damage was instantaneous and catastrophic. The sound of the explosions, the rising smoke, the sight of American aircraft, unmistakable with their rounded tails and white stars, flying with impunity over the heart of the empire, shattered a core national myth. In the streets of Tokyo, the initial confusion turned to panic. At the Imperial General Headquarters, the reaction was one of stunned, humiliated silence. Then volcanic rage. The sacred soil had been defiled, the divine wind had not blown. The boast of invulnerability, so carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, was exposed as a hollow fiction in the span of 15 minutes. The raiders, their bombs gone, turned southwest, pushing their fuel-starved aircraft toward the distant, fading hope of China. Behind them, they left not ruins, but a seismic crack in the Japanese strategic psyche. The shockwave from those few scattered explosions would ripple outwards, forcing a reaction that would fundamentally alter the course of the war in the Pacific. The era of unquestioned Japanese expansion was over. The era of desperate, reactive defense was about to begin. The immediate crisis for Doolittle's raiders began the moment their bombs fell away. The early launch had consumed their fuel margin. Now, with a 1,100-mile over water flight to China ahead of them, battling headwinds and navigating by fading celestial fixes and guesswork, their situation grew increasingly precarious. Night fell, and with it came cloud, rain, and a terrifying void over the East China Sea. The carefully planned flight to designated, lit airfields in unoccupied China dissolved into a scattered struggle for individual survival. One by one, their engines began to cough and die, starved of the last ounces of fuel. Captain Edward York's B-25, realizing it could not possibly reach the mainland, made a stark decision. He diverted north to the Soviet Union, landing near Vladivostok. The Crew interned for over a year would eventually escape through Iran, but their aircraft was confiscated, a minor diplomatic irritant for Stalin. The other 15 bombers pressed on into the darkness over the Chinese coast, some crews bilayed out into black, mountainous nothingness. Others, like that of Ted Lawson in the Ruptured Duck, attempted a crash landing on a dark beach, a violent impact that mangled the aircraft and severely injured the men. Doolittle himself parachuted into a paddy field, landing in the rain and mud. As he gathered himself, he was consumed by a profound sense of failure. He believed the raid had been a tactical fiasco, the early launch ruining the mission, his aircraft lost, and his men scattered, captured, or dead. I felt lower than a frog's posterior, he would later recount. But in those very moments of apparent disaster, the operation's deeper, strategic success was already being cemented. The news, fractured and chaotic, began to filter into the outside world. In Chongqing, the capital of nationalist China, reports from guerrilla networks told of American airmen descending from the sky. In Washington, an anxious President Roosevelt waited. When a coded confirmation finally arrived, he addressed the press with deliberate theatrical ambiguity, asked where the bombers had originated. He grinned and said they had come from Shangri-La, the mythical Himalayan paradise from the novel Lost Horizon. The American public, starved for good news, erupted in jubilation. Newspapers screamed of a stunning blow against Japan. Morale, so brittle after months of defeat, solidified into a fierce resolve. The Doolittle raid was a propaganda triumph of the first order, proving the Japanese giant could be bloodied. In Tokyo, however, the reaction was of an entirely different magnitude. The initial public facade was one of contemptuous dismissal. The government-controlled press downplayed the damage, calling it a do-nothing raid and mocking the insignificant results. But behind the walls of the imperial palace and the imperial general headquarters, the atmosphere was one of apoplectic fury and profound shame. Emperor Hirohito, who had been in his library during the raid, was reportedly shaken and angry. The military, whose primary sacred duty was the defense of the throne, had failed catastrophically. Admiral Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, received the news aboard his super battleship Yamato. He was reportedly physically ill with humiliation. The raid was a personal and professional insult. He had warned that a failure to decisively crush the American carriers at Pearl Harbor would come back to haunt them. Now, those very carriers had delivered a slap to the face of the divine emperor. The staff officers who had so confidently boasted of the homeland's inviolability were now scrambling to explain the inexplicable. A frantic and brutal hunt for the raiders began in China, where Japanese forces launched the massive Zhejiangjiangxi campaign, a punitive sweep that would eventually kill an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians in retaliation for aiding the American airmen. But the immediate military response was not just about revenge. It was about eliminating the root of the humiliation and ensuring it could never happen again. The raid had done more than bomb Tokyo. It had exposed a fatal flaw in the Japanese strategic worldview, and from that exposure would bloom a reaction that would change everything. The strategic earthquake triggered by the Doolittle raid did not manifest in a new Japanese defensive posture, but in a furious, aggressive lunge. The humiliation demanded not a shield, but a sword, a decisive, war-winning blow that would forever secure the perimeter and annihilate the American carrier threat. For Admiral Yamamoto, the raid was the final, irrefutable argument for his long-contemplated, high-stakes gambit, the invasion and capture of Midway Atoll. The plan, designated Operation MI, was breathtaking in its ambition and complexity. Its core objective was to lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a final, decisive battle where Japan's superior carrier and battleship strength would crush it. Midway, a tiny coral atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, was the bait. Yamamoto argued that its capture would extend Japan's defensive perimeter provide a base for harassing Hawaii and, critically, deny the Americans a forward staging point from which further raids or even an attack on the home islands themselves could be launched. The Doolittle raid made this last point incendiary. No staff officer could now dismiss the possibility of an American strike from an advanced base. Midway had to be taken to plug the hole in the dike. Yamamoto's plan, however, was convoluted, predicated on American predictability and Japanese dispersal of force. It involved multiple task forces operating across thousands of miles of ocean, a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands in the north to draw U.S. forces away, a transport group with invasion troops from Midway, a powerful carrier striking force, the Kaido Budai under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, with 4 frontline carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu to soften up the island's defenses, and the main body, Yamamoto's own force, centered on the super battleship Yamato, lurking behind to ambush the American fleet when it sortied to relieve Midway. It was a masterpiece of over-engineering, its weaknesses born of the overwhelming confidence that still lingered, and the panicked need for absolute security born of the Doolittle humiliation. The Americans, however, were no longer operating in the dark. U.S. Navy cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken the Japanese Naval Code, JN-25B. They knew an operation was coming, and through brilliant ruse, having the base at Midway send a false, unencrypted message about broken water condenser, they confirmed the target was AF, their code for Midway. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Pacific Fleet commander, now possessed the priceless advantage of foreknowledge. With only 3 carriers available, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, he devised a simple, lethal counter-strategy. He would position his carriers northeast of Midway, lying in wait for Nagumo's strike force. He would use Midway itself as an unsinkable 4th carrier, its land-based bombers to harass and distract the Japanese. The stage was set not for a Japanese ambush, but for an American one. On June 4, 1942, the fleets converged. The battle unfolded not as a clash of battle lines, but as a series of violent, chaotic airstrikes. The initial Japanese attack on Midway left the airfield damaged but operational. Nagumo, caught in a fatal cycle of rearming his aircraft, first for a second strike on Midway, then belatedly for a naval target when American carriers were discovered, saw his flight decks turned into infernos. In the pivotal 5 minutes from 10:22 to 10:27 a.m., dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown found the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were transformed into blazing wrecks. The Huryu would launch a counter-strike that crippled the Yorktown before itself being sunk later that day. In a single morning, the heart of Japan's naval air power, the instrument of its victories from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, was destroyed. The Doolittle raid was the invisible hand that guided this catastrophe. It had forced the Japanese into a premature, overly complex offensive. It had fixated their strategic mind on the absolute security of the homeland, making the capture of Midway seem not just desirable but existentially necessary. It had made them reactive. Yamamoto's plan was, at its core, a direct, violent answer to the question posed by the appearance of Doolittle's B-25s over Tokyo. How do we make sure this never happens again? The answer, conceived in shame and executed in hubris, led them directly into the trap at Midway. The raid's true bombs had been psychological, and they detonated not on April 18th but on June 4th, sinking 4 Japanese fleet carriers, and with them, Japan's hopes for a negotiated victory. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had irrevocably passed to the United States. The boasting from Tokyo's high command was now silenced, replaced by the grim realization that the war they had started was entering a new, and for them, a fatal phase. The human cost of the Doolittle raid began to mount in the days and weeks following the explosions over Tokyo. Of the 80 raiders, 69 would ultimately survive the war. Their fates were a harrowing mosaic of fortune, endurance, and sacrifice. 3 men. Corporal Leland D. Factor, killed during his parachute landing. Sergeant Donald E. Fitzmaurice and Staff Sergeant William J. Dieter, who drowned after ditching, were lost. In the immediate aftermath, the crew of Captain Edward York interned in the Soviet Union began a long, tense diplomatic odyssey. For the others who bilayed out or crash-landed in Japanese-occupied China, a desperate game of survival unfolded. Local Chinese civilians and guerrilla forces at tremendous risk sheltered, fed, and guided the Americans toward safety. The Japanese response was swift and merciless. Infuriated by the aid given to the raiders, Imperial Japanese Army forces launched the massive Zhejiangjiangxi campaign. This punitive operation saw whole villages burned, suspected collaborators tortured and executed, and germ warfare units deployed. Estimates of Chinese civilians killed in retaliation range from 250,000 to 250,000, a horrifying ratio of lives lost for every American airman saved. The raid's moral shadow stretched far beyond its military footprint. 8 raiders were not so fortunate as to evade capture. After a brutal interrogation, they were put on a show trial for alleged war crimes, specifically the bombing of civilian schools and hospitals, accusations stemming from Japanese propaganda. They were found guilty and sentenced to death. 5 of those sentences were later commuted to life imprisonment by direct order of Emperor Hirohito, a rare intervention. The other 3 pilots, Dean Hallmark and William Farrow, and gunner Harold Spatz, were taken to a Shanghai cemetery on October 15, 1942, blindfolded and tied to wooden stakes. They were executed by firing squad. Their deaths and the suffering inflicted upon the Chinese populace were the raid's darkest, most sobering legacies, a stark counterpoint to the jubilation in the United States. In Japan, the official narrative remained one of defiant minimization. Publicly, the raid was dismissed as a do-nothing failure, but within the inner sanctums of power, the psychological reckoning was profound. The Imperial Japanese Navy, humiliated by its failure to defend the sacred capital, engaged in bitter recriminations with the Army over air defense responsibilities. More importantly, the raid shattered the myth of the Kokutai as a physical shield. If the spiritual essence of Japan could not stop American bombers, then only raw, overwhelming military power could. This thinking directly fueled the aggressive, risk-acceptant mindset that led to the Midway operation. The need to eliminate the possibility of a second, potentially more devastating attack became an obsessive driver. The raid had injected a virus of insecurity into the Japanese high command, one that compelled them to overreach in a desperate attempt to restore their sense of invulnerability. The boasting had ceased, replaced by a volatile mixture of shame, rage, and strategic desperation. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4-7, 1942, was the direct, thunderous echo of the Doolittle raid. In its aftermath, the strategic map of the Pacific War was redrawn. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 frontline aircraft carriers, a heavy cruiser, over 250 aircraft, and most critically, an irreplaceable cadre of highly trained pilots and maintenance crew. The United States lost the carrier Yorktown and a destroyer. The numerical and qualitative balance of naval air power shifted decisively in America's favor. Japan's offensive capability, the spearhead of its expansion, was broken. The initiative passed irrevocably to the United States, setting the stage for the grueling island-hopping counteroffensives at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But the Doolittle raid's impact extended beyond the catalyst for Midway. It had a profound effect on American strategy and morale. President Roosevelt's need for morale victory had been answered tenfold. Jimmy Doolittle, fearing a court-martial for the loss of all aircraft, was instead awarded the Medal of Honor by a grateful president and promoted 2 grades to brigadier general. The raiders became national icons. Their story, a foundational myth of American resilience and ingenuity. The raid proved the Value of inter-service cooperation and out-of-the-box thinking, lessons that would be baked into the U.S. military's operational culture for the remainder of the war. It also validated the concept of strategic bombing, even in a limited form, as a tool for psychological warfare, foreshadowing the devastating B-29 firebombing campaigns that would bring the war back to Japan's cities with horrific finality years later. For the Japanese High Command, the raid's shadow never lifted. The obsession with absolute perimeter defense, born from the humiliation of April 18, continued to dictate. Flawed strategy, it manifested in the fanatical, sacrifice-heavy defense of isolated islands. Deemed crucial to the absolute national defense sphere, it drained resources into fortifying positions that would be bypassed and rendered irrelevant. The psychological need to never again suffer such a blow to imperial dignity contributed to the increasingly desperate and costly tactics that characterized Japan's war from 1943 onward, including the rise of kamikaze attacks, a literal fusion of the spiritual Yamamoto Damasha and the suicidal, born from a sense of material inferiority that the Doolittle raid had first exposed. Verifiable reports from within Japan after the war underscored the raid's deep psychological penetration. While physical damage was repaired quickly, the memory lingered. Admiral Yamamoto's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Mugaki, confided in his diary the profound sense of shock and failure. Japanese civilians interviewed later recalled the strange mix of fear and disbelief the day the war came home. For the military leadership, it was the end of a certain kind of arrogance. Historian Gordon Prange noted that after Doolittle, the Japanese fought with the fury of the betrayed. They had believed their own propaganda of invincibility, and the betrayal of that belief generated a corrosive doubt even amidst their later, fierce resistance. The Doolittle raid, therefore, stands as one of history's most potent examples of a tactical operation achieving a decisive strategic effect through psychological means. It cost the United States 16 bombers and the tragic loss of a few airmen and countless Chinese allies. In return, it shattered an enemy's foundational myth, triggered a chain of events that led to the pivotal victory at Midway and steeled the American home front for the long war ahead. It was a masterstroke not of destruction, but of perception, a demonstration that no fortress, however distant or confident, was beyond reach. The boasting from Tokyo's high command did not simply cease, it was rendered forever impossible, replaced by the grim certainty of a war that would now, inevitably, be brought to their doorstep again. In the grand, brutal arithmetic of World War II, the Doolittle raid registers as a minor event. 16 bombers, a handful of bombs, negligible physical damage, yet its true weight is measured not in tons of explosives, but in the seismic shift it triggered in the psychological landscape of the war. It was a precisely aimed strike at the enemy's center of gravity, not their industry, but their conviction. The raid exposed the fatal flaw at the heart of Imperial Japan's strategy, the belief that will and spirit could create an impenetrable reality. For months, the Japanese High Command had operated within a self-reinforcing narrative of divine favor and strategic invincibility, a narrative built upon the smoldering success at Pearl Harbor. Doolittle's B-25s, emerging from an empty quarter of the sea, did more than drop bombs. They dropped a terrible truth. They proved that the vast ocean was a highway, not a moat. That American ingenuity and resolve could bridge any distance, that the Emperor was not protected by an invisible shield, but by fallible men and machines. This revelation was a toxin in the Japanese strategic bloodstream. The frantic, overcomplicated, and ultimately disastrous reaction, the lunge toward Midway, was a symptom of the poison. It was the act of a command structure trying violently to reassert a shattered certainty, to rebuild a wall that had been proven to be an illusion. In doing so, they presented their most valuable assets on a platter to an enemy waiting in the shadows with broken codes and a newfound confidence of its own. Thus, the legacy of the Doolittle raid is a lesson in the architecture of war. It reminds us that conflict is waged in the mind as fiercely as on the battlefield, that symbols can be as powerful as divisions, that a single, daring act can fracture an enemy's operational logic and force them to make fatal mistakes. The raiders did not win the war that day, but they changed its trajectory. They silenced the boasting in Tokyo and replaced it with a dread that would only deepen with time. They gave America its first myth of the Pacific fight, a story of audacity and payback that fueled the long, hard road ahead. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, they did not bring forth a fleet. They summoned a ghost that flew over Tokyo and in its passing whispered a promise of inevitable reckoning. The war from that moment on was on a clock that only ticked in one direction, toward the ultimate terrible conclusion that began with a spark of defiance in the spring of 1942.